someone attending the presentation. Good afternoon from Spain and the UK. Good morning in Brazil. We are going to start the presentation of the 4 papers that are included in this online ordinary session B, devoted to the theme of the industrialization, labor market flexibilization, and real exchange rate. So there are 4 papers that will be presented by 2 persons, 2 authors that will present 2 papers each, and we will follow the order that appears in the program. In this case, the 2 first papers that will be presented the presenter is me, Jesus Ferreiro, that I am also acting as chair of the session. I will present the paper titled Deindustrialization in Europe, it's widespread or limited to certain countries, and the second paper that is titled Labor Flexibility and Employment in Europe, a sectoral analysis. After the presentation of these 2 papers, the presentation and the debate, 2 papers will be also presented by Gabriel Palazzo from the Institute of Development Studies in UK, the Success University, I think. And the first paper is titled Real Exchange Rate and Import Substitution Episodes, Evidence from Argentina, 2003-2008. And the second article title is Real Exchange and Export Charge Episodes, What Sectors Take Advantage of the Real Exchange Rate Stimulus. And what we are, the way to organize the session implies that we will have around 15-20 minutes to present each paper. Once that this paper is presented, there will be a round of questions and comments from the audience, and then we will move to the next paper. And at the end, if there is some room, we will open a new round of questions and comments in general to any of the 4 papers included and presented in the session. So in this sense, what we are now is starting formally with the presentations. And as I mentioned, the first paper that will be presented is the paper that you can see. The title, again, I repeat, is The Industrialization in Europe, is it widespread or limited to certain countries? That is co-authored by me and with a colleague on my department, and also of the research group that is chaired by José Luis Ferreiro. And we both belong to the University of Basque Country in Spain. So to start now, well, the objective of this paper is to analyze the existence of a potential process of the industrialization in Europe. As you will know, in recent years, in many emerging and developing economies, and special attention has been paid to the existence of a process of the industrialization. In fact, for instance, this is a crucial problem, for instance, in Brazil. In these cases, there exists a process of premature or early deindustrialization. In an attempt to suggest the system of a process with different characteristics to those occurring in the case of the more advanced economies, where the process of loss of weight and the relative decline in the size of the manufacturing sector is attributed to, say, natural causes, who are derived from the greater growth of the services sector as a result of the greater demand for market services as the income level of individual rises. In these advanced economies, the industrialization, to say in this way, would be a natural consequence of the process of development. However, in the case of economies undergoing early or premature deindustrialization, the decline in the weight of the manufacturing sector occurs well before these countries reach a level of development similar to those of the more advanced economies. And it's generated by the inability for various reasons to cope with competition from developed countries and also from other emerging countries, for instance, that's located in Asia, China, for example. The industrialization in these countries will have serious consequences in the medium and long term by reducing the long-term growth potential of these economies, which is something that will prevent them from making progress in the process of real convergence to the more developed economies. However, as I mentioned, the process of the industrialization is not exclusive to developing countries, and indeed a large number of European countries are also affected by this phenomenon. The aim of this paper is to analyze the behavior of the manufacturing sector in European economies. To this end, we will analyze, or we are analyzing, let's say, the behavior of the manufacturing sector in European countries in the recent decades. In some cases, starting in the decades of the 60s, focusing on the behavior of three variables: the evolution of gross value added in the manufacturing sector, and also the evolution of total employment and salaried employment in the sectors. The study of these variables allows us to detect whether the phenomenon of the industrialization is generalized or whether, on the contrary, it's only concentrated in certain countries and economies. It will also reveal whether the industrialization is due to the greater growth of the services sector, this kind of natural deindustrialization, or whether, on the contrary, the industrialization is explained by the decline in gross value added and industrial employment, a phenomenon that will be associated with the lower international competitiveness of manufacturing industry in some European countries. Due to time and space constraints, we here will focus only on the study of the behavior of manufacturing real, that is measured in constant prices, of gross value added in the manufacturing sector. And we are analyzing the data from 31 different European economies, some of them belonging to the European Union and some of them that are not yet part of the European Union. Our objective is to analyze the behavior of the manufacturing sector in Europe in order to determine whether the weight of this sector, measured as a percentage of total gross value added in the countries analyzed, has changed over the years for which data are available. Once we have identified the countries where a process of industrialization, we imply this industrialization as a decline in the weight of manufacturing gross value added has been observed, we analyze whether this decline is due to the fact that real manufacturing gross value added has fallen in the absolute terms, what we're talking of a true deindustrialization, or whether the lower weight of manufacturing is explained just only by the higher growth of other sectors. We can say this a process of natural deindustrialization related to the process of development in these countries. So the analysis of the results of the evolution of the gross value added in the manufacturing sector has led us to check that we can identify 5 different groups of countries in Europe. In the slide, we are now analyzing and checking the evolution of countries, of a group of countries, namely 8 countries, namely Austria, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Ireland, Lithuania, and Slovakia, where we can see a continuous permanent increase in the weight of manufacturing, as in terms of the size, the percentage of the total gross value added in these economies. In these countries, when we can see for the data that appears at the right part of the slide, we can see that there has been by the data of the graph, that there has been a virtually continuous and sustained upward trend in the weight of manufacturing with very small, in many cases, cyclical fluctuations. Beside this first group of countries, we can detect a second group of countries that in this case where the weight of manufacturing has remained quite stable or at most has slightly increased. This is a second group of countries that is formed by 3 countries, Slovenia, Sweden, and Switzerland, whereas you can see the weight of manufacturing has increased, but by a very small amount. Moreover, it's also important to note that in all these 3 cases, the weight of the industry fluctuates strongly, with remarkable turning points and dips, ups and downs, especially in the case of Sweden, that is the line that is the orange line. And if we take together, if we add the countries of the groups 1 and 2, the conclusion is that we can see that there in Europe, there has been, out of the 31 economies that we have studied, there have been 11 economies where the weight of industry would have increased, and that consequently, they have not been affected by the process of the industrialization. Indeed, from a long-term perspective, the weight of the manufacturing industry has increased in the in the last decades. The third group of countries, however, are characterized by precisely the opposite behavior. This third group is formed by 9 countries: Belgium, Croatia, France, Luxembourg, Malta, Norway, Serbia, Spain, and the United Kingdom, where the share of manufacturing in total gross value added has been declining in the last decades. What is behind this decline? Well, what we have done here, you can see in this slide, in the 2 figures, we have analyzed the evolution, the behavior of the real industrial GVI, as I tell you, measured in the constant terms, and where the evolution is represented by, we have considered that the gross value added in manufacturing in the year 2001 has been equivalent to 100, and then we can analyze in this sense, in a more comparable way, the evolution of the industry in these sectors. And what we can see is that there are 5 countries that are formed by Spain, Norway, France, Luxembourg, and Croatia. It's better observed in the figure of the down of the slides, where real industrial gross value added has fallen in absolute terms in recent years, what allows us to speak of a process of real or genuine or true deindustrialization in these countries. Indeed, in the case of Luxembourg, Croatia, and Spain, there has been a sharp decline in industrial activity in 2007, when the beginning of the financial crisis. I must remember it. Although the sector increases its activity in all these countries after the end of the Great Recession, it suffers again a new decline with the crisis of the COVID pandemic. And although it subsequently recovers, the result in all the cases is that in the year 2022, the absolute value of the industrial gross value added, that is the value of the industrial activity in this country, is lower than in the year 2007. The decline, for instance, in industry in Spain is particularly severe, with the result that in 2022, that is the last available year, industrial gross value added in Spain is almost 10% lower than in the year 2007. The case of Norway is different because although the impact of the financial crisis diminishes and an historical peak is reached in the year 2014, again, from that year, the Norwegian industry enters in a situation of decline from then on, with the result that in 2022, the Norwegian industrial gross value added is almost 6% lower than in the year 2014. In the case, finally, the case of France is slightly different because the decline that we can detect in industrial gross value added occurs with the COVID pandemic, and it has not recovered the pre-pandemic levels. Another group of of countries is formed by, again, 4 countries: Cyprus, Latvia, Netherlands, and Germany, where the industrial GDP is declining until some year, certain years, from which on it starts again to rise. Although the size of the industrial of the manufacturing gross value added does not reach, is therefore lower than at the beginning of the years for which data are available. In the case of Latvia, the Netherlands, and Germany, the turning point, that is the lower percentage of the manufacturing gross value added, takes place in the year 2009, when the weight of industrial gross value added starts to rise since this year. Therefore, it is rising during the last 13 years, and it's rising an amount that is close to 3 percentage points of the gross value added in Latvia and Germany, and almost 1.4 percentage points in the Netherlands. And in the Cyprus, the turning point is later. It occurs in 2013, and since then the industrial gross value added is increasing. As I mentioned, in all the 4 countries, in this sense, the weight of the manufacturing sector is lower than in the first year. But it is because we are measuring, as I say, the share in terms of the total gross value added. If we focus only on the evolution of the real industrial GVA gross value added, we can see that it has been gradually increasing with some ups and downs, that most of them, in most cases, are related to the financial crisis. The only exception is Latvia. As you can see in the figure, the reason is that there is, we can detect a huge fall, a huge decline in, it seems like it's a cliff, in industrial gross value added that is recorded in the year 1992. That is 1 year after Latvia independence. Latvia would therefore be the only case where a process for the industrialization has been observed. Although, as you can see, it's permanently rising since the size of gross value added since during the last 2 decades. And it's worth noting that when in the previous group of countries, the financial crisis has had a lasting negative effect on manufacturing, with a decline not only in its weight and in the total economy, but also in the real value of manufacturing gross value added, it's important to notice that in this group, the effect of the financial crisis has been only temporary. And indeed, the manufacturing gross value added in the year 2022 is higher than that registered that are recorded in the year 2007. Another group of countries would be formed by countries where the weight of industry is higher, or say it's very similar than that registered at the beginning of the period analysis, but that has been decreasing since a certain year. So we can detect a group of 6 countries, that is Finland, Greece, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, and Romania, that is characterized by the fact that although industrial gross value added is higher or more or less similar in the year 2022 than at the beginning of the period, that in some cases are talking of the years that goes to the 60s, to early 60s. However, there is a tipping point that we can detect a peak from which the weight of the manufacturing begins to decline significantly. As shown in the right-hand side of the slide, that we can see that since a certain year, the weight of the gross manufacturing gross value added has been declining, and therefore the industry manufacturing sector is losing importance. However, of these 6 countries, and now what we are doing is in a similar way that we have done before, where you can see the evolution of the manufacturing gross value added, again, I repeat, measuring constant prices. Only in 2 countries, the recent decline in the weight of manufacturing is explained by a fall, by the decline in the real value of manufacturing gross value added. These countries are, as you can see in this figure, and the right part of the last years of the figures, these countries are Greece and Finland. In both countries, the peak value of manufacturing output is recorded again in what year? Yes, 2007. In both cases, industrial production falls sharply from 2007 onwards, and although it recovers from 2013 onwards, industrial GVA gross value added in 2022 is still lower than in the year 2007, with the result that in both cases, in Finland and in Greece, the manufacturing gross value added in 2022 is around 22% lower than that registered in the year 2007. And finally, we have the last group of countries that is, in this case, formed by a single country. The country is Italy. What is the peculiarity of Italy that what makes different from the other countries? Well, the peculiarity is that although in Italy, although the weight of the industrial sector is much higher in 2022 than at the beginning of the process of the period than in the year 1960, it still peaks in the 90s, in 1980, and is maintained with fluctuations until the year, say, 1995. From then on, it falls until the year 2013, grows again until 2007, suffers a decline, and then starts to grow again. However, when we look at the figures of the real industrial gross value added at the graph on the right, what we can see is that the industrial production is growing in a sustained way until the year 2007, and then falls by 21% in the years 2007 and 2009. Since then, it has increased, although it's still lower than in the year 2001. And therefore, we can say that there has been a process of deindustrialization in Italy over the last 2 decades, with again the financial crisis, being behind this process. So, and to conclude, what we can say with this data is that although in most European countries the weight of manufacturing industry has fallen, we cannot talk of a generalized process of industrialization in Europe. It at most affects only a majority, but not all countries. On the other hand, we have been able to detect different groups of countries or patterns of development in the industrial production that can be observed in those countries where the weight of the manufacturing sector is decreasing. And what is important is we must remember the names of these countries, that these groups are made up of countries with very different characteristics, not only in terms of the level of development. They are included highly developed countries, but also say less developed European countries, but also in terms of other factors, such, for instance, membership, they are a member or not of the European Union, or even the year or when they joined the European Union. They differ in terms of the membership or not to the European Euro area, the previous size of the industrial sector, to be part of the former Eastern Europe, and so on. So we cannot be able to detect a clear and common pattern of evolution of the manufacturing sector that can attribute the evolution, the maintenance, the decline, or the rise in the size of manufacturing to a specific or a general or common factor or element. Moreover, also the number of countries, important to note that the number of countries where the loss of importance of the industrial sector is due to a fall in the real absolute value of manufacturing gross value added is very small. And therefore, the process of the real industrialization only takes place in a low number of European countries: Spain, Norway, Luxembourg, Croatia, Latvia, Greece, Finland, Italy, and to some extent France. This leads us to believe and to conclude that there must be specific characteristics and features of these economies what explain the system of the industrialization they are suffering, rather than generalized factors common to all European countries. But in any case, what is important, and it's noteworthy to remark, is the key role that must have been played by the financial crisis in the process of industrialization. In most of these cases, the process of the industrialization began or deepened dramatically during and after the financial crisis in the year 2007 and 2008 and the subsequent Great Recession, which means that this crisis had a particular and lasting impact on the industrial sector in these countries. So this will be the presentation of this paper. I don't know if there is I will try to check if there is some comment or question at the channel on YouTube. So I don't know if there is some comment or questions.
I have a question while we wait for the comments from YouTube. What are your hypotheses about why there are different performance between different kind of groups of countries? So do you have any hypothesis about that, or what are the determinants of those different performance?
Well, in this case, my main hypothesis is that, as I mentioned, it can because in some cases the evolution of the industrial sector in Europe is sometimes attributed to the common economic policies implemented in Europe. The consequences, for instance, of the impact of the fiscal austerity policies, or the implication of the monetary policies, or for instance, in some cases, it's also argued that it can be related to, for instance, the role played by, because it's important, for instance, in developing countries, probably we will talk about it later, about it's related to the evolution of exchange rate, or the real exchange rate in this case, related to the evolution of the euro. But however, what we could see is that when we look at the groups where the countries where, for instance, the weight of manufacturing has increased, we are now seeing, for instance, there are countries that belong to the European Union from not the last one. They are not related to, for instance, the countries of the former Eastern Europe. And we are talking of countries that belong to the euro, countries that are quite highly developed, say, for instance, Austria. We have countries from the Western European countries, Eastern European countries, countries where the previous size of the manufacturing sector is higher, is lower. And something similar happens when we look at the countries, for instance, Group C, where the manufacturing is decreasing. So they have hardly little in common. So it's difficult to say that can be a different, a common pattern, what has created this process. That's why I say that in this case, however, there is a common element. In most of the cases, as I said, the industrialization started immediately after the burst of the financial crisis, or if there was a process of the industrialization, this process accelerated. So I think it's a question of the specific national characteristics in these countries, in probably the type of policies. What if you ask me about one, for instance, one hypothesis? It would be something that I will have to explore. We'll have to explore. But I think, for instance, that the problem could be related, for instance, to the policies in the labor market. That in many cases, and this is something that, for instance, in the case of Spain, we have detected a long time ago, is that, for instance, the excessive flexibilization of the labor market has favored the evolution of the rise of the in a movement in the economy from manufacturing to the service sectors, and it has acted as a brake to the recovery of these sectors in the economy after degradation. Since the year 2013, it has been impeded that economic recovery are not taking place in those sectors. So I think that could be an explanation. That in this case, with the, in other words, with the policies to flexibilize the labor market, they have forgotten other policies that could be promote the competitiveness of these economies. And probably in many cases, they have tried to base the economies on a reduction of the labor cost, trying to create this kind of nominal competitiveness, and has forgotten to implement other kind of policies. The problem, obviously, in these economies is that it's impossible to compete with other economies who has lower cost of production, can be the Asian one. So this has made that in these economies we have a serious problem of real deindustrialization.
Thank you very much. No chat questions.
No, I have been checking also in the YouTube. So, well, if there is no question, I think that we can move to my second presentation that to some extent is related precisely to the.
I think we lost Jesus. Probably he will join.
I kicked him out accidentally.
You?
Oh my god! Wait. Wait.
Maybe he continued presenting alone.
Do you have his contact easily?
No, I have it. The email.
I only have his email.
Yeah, me too.
Oh my god! Wait. Wait a little.
So, is there anyone in YouTube or?
Yeah. Just wait a little.
Okay, don't worry.
Oh, he's back. He's back.
I don't know the reason, but suddenly I have disconnected from the StreamYard, so I have had to connect again.
No, it's fine. Just upload your slides again and you can begin. Okay, let's go.
Okay. So I apologize again. So, as explained before, the next paper is titled "The Labor Flexibility and Employment in Europe, a Sectoral Analysis." So, the objective of this paper is to analyze whether one institutional element of the labor market, namely the employment protection legislation, what's called EPL, that is the legal conditions that regulate the hiring of workers and their dismissal or termination, can be considered as an explanatory variable, a relevant determinant, a relevant variable to explain the employment and employment outcomes in European countries, specifically in our case for the growth of total employment and employees or wage earners or salaried employment, as you want to name it. So in this sense, the results that have been obtaining in this, not a descriptive, but it's an empirical and econometric analysis that we will present, obtaining allows to test the validity, or will allow us to test the validity of the new Keynesian hypothesis that the interaction between economic growth and labor institutions determines labor market economies. And as a corollarium, the recommendation that to get and to achieve better labor market outcomes, higher growth of employment and a strong decline in unemployment rates, flexibilization measures to flexibilize the labor market institution must be adopted. So in our concrete case, the objective of our paper is to analyze whether those labor markets that have liberalized the labor market by reducing the permanent and temporary employment protection have had similar or different effects on employment in different sectors of the economy. Indeed, the theoretical background of this analysis is that, as mentioned, for new Keynesian economies, the employment protection legislation is a key element that affects labor market outcomes. And according to new Keynesian economies, a rigid labor market that in this case would be identified by a high employment protection for workers would lead to poor employment and unemployment outcomes. That is, that the countries that do have poorest outcomes in terms of employment creation and in terms of the size of unemployment will be characterized by having a rigid labor market and a high employment protection for all types of workers. Following these recommendations, in the last decades in Europe, but also outside Europe, not only developed, but also developing countries, have made the labor market more flexible, approving reforms that have reduced, in our case, firing costs for permanent workers, and that have favored the use of atypical contracts, temporary or part-time contracts, or even agency workers, to accelerate job creation and to reduce unemployment rates. However, despite the extent of these reforms, the empirical evidence is not conclusive about what has been the results of these reforms. Indeed, a growing body of work, the more recent work, concludes that employment protection does not affect employment or unemployment, and that the excessive labor flexibility caused by intense intense measures to reduce the employment protection has led to negative micro but also macroeconomic effects in these economies. However, although empirical studies conclude, the recent empirical studies conclude that the effect on overall employment is nil or not significant, this does not mean that such reforms have not had an impact on certain groups of workers, depending on aspects such as, for instance, the type of the contract of the workers, the skills of the workers, the age, the gender, and so on. And thus, it's concluded that these kind of reforms may have contributed to segmentate or to raise the segmentation in the labor market. And in this sense, our paper takes this direction, and our aim is to investigate something that, to our knowledge, has not been developed now, whether labor flexibility affects employment differently depending on the economic sector, the activity, the economic activity analyzed. So in this sense, this is the main novelty, or in another way, the main contribution of our papers to literature, because we are analyzing, in this case, the determinants of the evolution, the growth, the rate of growth of total employment, and also employees in 5 economic sectors: agriculture, forestry and fishing, we'll name it agriculture, in short, construction, industry, excluding manufacturing, name it industry in short, manufacturing, in services. So what we are doing is a study, and not only we'll see a possible linear relationship between the dependent variables and employment protection, but also, for instance, the possible existence of a non-linear relation, or the existence, for instance, of interaction effects between employment protection and economic growth. And to do this analysis, what we are doing is the evolution, the growth of employment and employees in 13 European countries. That's the one that appears in the slide: Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and United Kingdom. And we are analyzing, important to remark that we are analyzing a very long period of time, in 35 years in total, from the year 1985 to 2019. That is the year from which we have the latest available data about employment protection legislation. That is, we are using, in this case, in the indices elaborated by the OECD. So our baseline model is the one that appears in the slide, where we are analyzing the determinants of 2 different variables, explained variables: the growth rate of total employment, but also the growth rate of employees. Our hypothesis is that in principle, the variable that should be directly affected should be employees, not total employment, because the employment protection legislation in principle is focused on salaried workers. And we are testing a linear relation with 2 main exploratory variables: the growth rate of gross value added is related to the economic growth, and also the indicator related to the employment protection legislation, using the EPR and EPT indices elaborated by the OECD. The EPR is the indices that try to measure the employment protection for permanent workers, and the EPT is the employment protection to temporary workers. And we are using also as a control variables, the usual ones used in the analysis. For instance, the growth rate of working age population, trying to analyze the potential influence of demographic factors, and other variables related to the labor institutions, such as the union density, or the coordination and decentralization of the wage setting process. In this sense, it's important to note that we have a large dynamic model with a number of years above 30. So in this sense, in difference with the most of the empirical studies existing, that are based on shorter period of time, therefore a short panel, we are using a dynamic fixed effect model that is more efficient than the usual generalized method of moments that are a good method, but only for panels with a shorter number of periods. And as you can see, this model is based on a linear relation between the explanatory planed variable, in this case, and the explanatory variables. And we are also trying to make some robustness checks, checking, for instance, the existence of nonlinear effects of employment protection by including a quadratic relation on employment growth or employee growth, the existence, for instance, of interaction effects between employment protection and economic growth, or even the existence of nonlinear effects of economic growth. And as I mentioned, we have made this analysis for each of the 5 sectors that we have studied. Here you can see the summary statistics, where although we can see a positive growth in the economic activity of this sector, we can observe different behavior in terms of employment in the 5 sectors. In some cases, these differences takes place not only in employees or in total employment. In both cases are the same in both variables. What is important is that in this case, similarly, the relation between the economic activity, the rate of growth or the evolution of the gross value added is not related, at least directly, to the evolution of the employment or employees, because despite that we are seeing a positive growth in the gross value of all the 5 sectors, in some cases there is a difference, and even, for instance, a negative evolution of the employment in some sectors. So it's suggesting that there must be other factors besides economic growth that explain the evolution of employment in the sectors. In this figure, that it cannot be seen very well, what we represent is the evolution of the average or the mean of this variable for during these 35 years for the 13 countries. What is important to notice, in case we focus on the below in the 4th line, is that we can see a reduction, a strong reduction in the evolution of the employment protection for permanent and regular workers in the lines related to the mean of EPR and EPT. According to the orthodox neo-Keynesian approach, this should have been translated into a higher growth of employment in employees, but these results are not observed when we look at the behavior of the different sectors. And this is something that is detected in our empirical analysis. So in the next slides, we will present the results of the determinants of the rate of growth of employment and salaried employment, wage earners growth, for the 5 sectors. Agriculture, remember, agriculture, construction, industry, manufacturing, and services. And what is important is that the results are markedly different for each of the sectors. They don't have a common pattern. And therefore, the determinants of the evolution of the growth of employment and employees are different in the 5 sectors. And as we will see, the impact or the effect of the employment protection, it's also different. What is important to stress, because in this case, if the evolution, the impact of employment protection is different in each sector, obviously the impact of the reforms that we have been able to see that have reduced the employment protection for temporary or regular workers have been different in the 5 sectors. So, for instance, in the case of the agriculture, our main findings is that we can see that the growth in the sector does not translate into an increase in employment. So the evolution of employment in agriculture has not to do with the evolution of the sector. And also that employment protection, both permanent and temporary, has a negative impact on salaried employment. Not on total, but on the evolution of wage earners. So that the conclusion is that the measures to reduce employment protection would have contributed to reducing the trend in the decline in salaried employment in the agricultural sector. So something could say that the labor flexibility would have a positive impact on the evolution, on the growth of salaried employment in this sector. In construction, the results are different. Curiously, the employment protection does not affect at all the evolution of the growth of wage earners, of the salaried employment. Although in equation 3, the interaction effect of employment protection for temporary workers with growth is significant, the growth of the sector and the employment protection index are not significant. In the case of total employment, the economic growth would have a negative impact on total employment growth, but the employment protection for indexes for regular and permanent workers, EPR and EPT indexes, has a positive interaction effect with growth. See at the question 3. So that the higher the protection for permanent and temporary employment, the lower the job destruction. In fact, with above average levels of sectoral GB growth of gross value added and employment protection, total employment protection will be positive. And what this data shows is that in construction, that the measures that reduce employment protection have a negative impact on employment growth, reducing its growth unless these measures are accompanied by an increase in the activity of sector. So in this sense, in the construction, a higher level of employment protection can be considered as positive for the evolution of employment. In the industry sector, that remember is not included manufacturing, what we observe in equations 2, both for employment and wage earners, is that the employment protection for temporary workers has a positive but decreasing effect on the growth of total and salaried employment. That is, we detect a non-linear relation. In the case of total employment, the effect starts to decrease from an index of employment protection of nearly 2.7. That in the case of the wage earners is when EPT is above 3.0. But we must recall that the average EPT is 12. Indeed, this data will show is that the employment protection only has a negative effect on employment when it is above 5.3 points. What is important is that no country has, in the period, in the 30 years that we have studied, has reached this level of protection. And actually, while salaried, in the case of salaried employment, this would be only reduced by employment protection if employment protection for temporary workers is above 6%, 6 points. And the relevant point is that the maximum possible value of this index is only 6. So therefore, measures to make temporary employment more flexible would have helped or have contributed to reduce employment growth in this sector, in the sector of the industry. So in this sense, again, employment protection for temporary employment would have a positive impact on employment industry in Europe, and the reforms that have reduced the protection for these workers would have had a negative impact on employment industry. In the case of manufacturing, although permanent employment protection does not have a direct impact on employment, total and salaried, we find a negative interaction effect with economic growth, as we see in the equation 3. This means that the employment protection reduces total and salaried employment creation generated by the growth of reduces the positive impact that economic growth has on manufacturing employment. And therefore, reducing employment protection for permanent workers will have a positive impact in terms of job creation. However, the case of employment protection for temporary workers is quite the opposite. Although its direct effect on total and salary employment is negative, the interaction effect with the economic growth in the sector is positive. What this means? Well, it implies that the impact or negative impact of employment protection for temporary workers is reduces, the higher is lower, the higher the economic growth. And therefore, the higher the economic growth, the lower the employment negative impact of EPT. Therefore, measures to reduce protection to temporary workers would have a negative impact on employment. So we consider it a negative for the evolution of employment.
Jesus, sorry for interrupt, but we are seeing the slide of construction.
Sorry.
Yeah. There.
Yeah, this is the industry. And in the case of manufacturing, we can see, it's in the case of, you can see the evolution of the slide, you can detect an interaction impact between economic growth and employment protection. It is important because what this implies is that there is not an absolute impact of employment protection on employment. It depends also the interaction, the combination between employment and protection, the measures that modify the level of protection, and the economic context in which it implies. So the impact is different, for instance, of a reform that reduces the employment protection, depending of this is being implied in a context of high economic growth, or if it takes place in a context of low economic growth. So there is no possibility of arguing that flexibilization, labor market reforms, the flexibilized labor market can have a specific positive or negative impact. It depends on the economic context. And in the case of the services, the employment protection does not affect the growth of salaried employment. We only observe a significant effect on employment in equation 3. We test for interactions with the effect with sector growth, but the results are inconclusive because the economic growth, the sectorial GVI, gross value of the growth, is not significant. And in the case of the employment protection for regular workers, the variable is not significant, although the interaction of economic growth with permanent employment will have a positive impact. So it's difficult to argue that there is a significant relevant impact. And in the case of the employment protection for temporary workers, it will reduce job creation. But again, this interaction effect is positive. So again, the higher the economic growth, the lower the impact of employment protection. Indeed, the employment protection only reduces employment in the services sector when the economic growth in this sector is below 3.6. So we can see that the impact is different between situations in where the economic growth of the service sector is above 3.6. In this case, it will be positive, the impact, the effect of the employment protection, but it would be negative, it is below. So in this sense, measures to reduce employment protection can be considered as having a negative impact on job creation in services. So to conclude and to summarize, so what we can see is that you have a summary of the, I will not to repeat, of the conclusion, is that as you can see, the impact of the employment protection is dramatically different. It varies a lot between sectors. It's different, the results in the evolution of the employment in agriculture, in construction, in manufacturing, and services. And in this sense, our main conclusion is that the employment effects of these reforms that have been reducing the employment protection in Europe are different, not only for total employment and for the wage of salary employment, but also the important thing is that it's quite different and it varies a lot between sector, and also it's important the impact is different depending on which protection has been reformed. That is, it has been a decline in the employment protection for permanent workers or temporary workers. So in this case, we think that it's important. It connects one thing that we were talking in our previous presentation is that what is important is that these reforms, although may have had a nil or not significant employment impact on total employment, it may have contributed to vary the composition of employment. And perhaps it can be contributed to increase the employment in some sectors, and on the contrary, it may have had a negative impact in terms of employment and probably in terms of production in some other sectors. So this will be the main conclusions of our presentation. So, questions?
I also have the questions if there are no other questions. No, I'm congratulations because it's a very interesting work. So, but I also am curious if you have checked if because what I'm thinking is that maybe it's important to try to understand if the different countries are doing this liberalization in the labor market in different moments, because maybe all the countries are doing the same at the same moment, so the relative protection of different countries is stay the same, but if one of the countries do not do the liberalization, maybe they have worse results.
Well, I think well, this is an interesting, very relevant question, because you must notice that we have studying empirical study is a study based on the panel data. So what does it mean? What we try to check is that we can say, the question is, can we say that a labor market reform has the same impact, in this case, in all the countries? Because that is what we're trying to do with the panel data. Try to detect if there is a common pattern or behavior in certain variables, and if in all the cases the same variable impacts on the same, on average, on the same on the whole sample of countries. In our case, we think that it's important. But why? To make this analysis, because the recommendations to flexibilize the labor market and to reduce the employment protection to all workers, temporary and permanent workers, has been a common trend in all the recommendations made by national and international institutions, from the International Monetary Fund to, for instance, in Europe, to European Commission. It was a general and universal receipt recommended for all the countries. Saying that, well, if you want to, you have a high unemployment rate, if you have poor outcomes in terms of employment creation, what you must do is, all the countries must do, is to reduce employment protection and to make the labor market more flexible. What we are now detecting is that, well, this general recommendation is simply wrong. And it's a mistake. Why? Because what we can say is that, well, we cannot make this kind of recommendation. Why? Because our empirical analysis show that when we analyze the behavior of all these economies, the result is that we can say, well, it has a negative or positive, but in most cases, what is better, probably the best conclusion that we can reach is that we cannot argue that employment protection legislation, that the reforms to change it, has had an impact on employment, at least on overall employment. Probably it does. It's excluding the possibility that some countries can be affected in a positive or negative way. Well, it may be. Perhaps in some circumstances, depending on the specific consideration of the country, in terms, for instance, of the level of employment protection, or perhaps in considering the economic situation, the GDP growth, it may have a positive impact or not. That is, maybe in one country, this kind of reform may have had a positive impact, and in another one, it can have a negative impact. But they must be specific to this country. So in this sense, we should make analysis country by country to analyze whether these labor institutions have different impact on this on the whole sample of countries that we can analyze. But for this, we must make an individual analysis, say analysis based on time series, because in this case we must go case by case. So I don't know if this responds to your question, but it's important to emphasize. This does not imply our conclusion that in some cases, some countries, a labor market reform can be positive or maybe negative. What we say is that our results show that we cannot say that any labor reform has a positive or negative impact. It depends. And it will depend on the whole economy, and also really it would depend on the specific circumstances of this sectoral activity in this country that we want to analyze.
Perfect. So actually, I would like to recommend, there is a methodology to use in time series, in panel time series data, that is called mean group or pool mean group, that I actually allowed for different kind of coefficients in each of the countries. So maybe it's a good way to explore data region.
Yes, because I think that they can be, the problem is that already, in the same way that you can say that perhaps the impact is different, also there has also, as you say, the possibility that the impact may be different for different group of countries. So, but again, it would reinforce our conclusion. Well, the labor market flexibilization would depend on the characteristics of the countries. What we are suggesting is that obviously countries with similar economic or political institutional characteristics will have we will be able to detect that the impact of these labor reforms must be the same or not. But obviously, again, it will be different between not only individual countries, but also will be different between different groups of countries. So, and there is no question. So if there is no question, we can move to the third presentation. And now we will start with the presentation made by Gabriel. And we will start with this paper. With the paper. It's the paper that appears in the fourth.
In the fourth position, yes.
Yeah, but it doesn't matter. So it's the paper, the article, the title, Real Exchange and Sports Search Episodes, what sector take advantage of the real exchange rate? So when you want, Gabriel.
Okay, great. So thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Jesus, and congratulations for your presentation. It was very interesting. So actually, I'm going to present two papers that are very related between each other in terms of methodology and in terms of the episode that I'm trying to, I will exploit to understand the effects of the exchange rates, and in terms of the conclusion as well, but looking at a different phenomenon. So I'm going to start explaining about the export search episodes and the relationship with the real exchange rates. And then I'm going to do a second presentation looking to a different tradable sector or a different tradable phenomena, that is the import substitution episode. But probably, I mean, all the time I will be referring to both presentations at the same time. So this is the outline of the presentation. So first, I'm going to start with the motivation and contribution that they think I'm doing here. I will take the time explaining the empirical strategy. Then I'm going to explain what I call export search episodes. That actually, this is defined in a previous paper that I have written with Martin Rapetti, but I used the results of that paper to understand then the heterogeneity, the sectoral heterogeneity of the sector that responds to the real exchange rate stimulus. So that's what I'm going to do in the fourth part of the presentation, where I'm going to analyze the determinant of export search episodes at sectoral level. And finally, I will show some results that I think is interesting, and it's interesting in terms of the literature of the real exchange rate and the effects of exports about hysteresis. I think that's the correct way to pronounce in English. That means that what I will try to show is that after the period of exchange rate undervaluation ends, still we can have, or we can see how the export level that these sectors achieved remain in the same level, and in a higher level than in the past. So it means that maybe a transitory stimulus through the exchange rate policy have permanent effects in the development of the export sectors of the. So what is the motivation? The motivation, I mean, the true motivation is that I'm tired about having balance of payment crisis in Argentina, but I cannot say that in the paper. But so the reason behind of this paper, the academic reason, is like most of development scholars agree that the most smart strategy for having like sustainable growth acceleration episodes is have an export growth that can keep the track and avoid to having balance of farming crisis. So to have an export-led growth strategy, you have to develop in some way export sectors. You have to increase your exports, and you have to increase a lot the export sectors, particularly in Latin American economies that depends a lot of natural resources. But if you want to industrialize and at the same time keep the track of having an export-led growth strategy, you have to figure out how you can develop export sector. So you can do a lot of different things, and there are a lot of different kind of policies that you can do to try to develop sectors or export sectors. But from a macroeconomic perspective, one variable that could be very important is the real exchange rate. No? So the question is, what can the macro do to help the micro? No? What the macro can do to help the micro? Is what can we do from being a macroeconomist to try to help develop the competitiveness of some export sectors. So, and actually here we have a great controversy, because we have some people that say, okay, there is some kind of elasticity pessimism, and the real exchange rate do not have any kind of role in the export performance. And also we have other kind of literature where, for example, Roberto Frenkel are a great contributor, as well as Reza Pereira or Danny Roddick from a more mainstream perspective, that they say, okay, real exchange undervaluation is a determinant, it's a positive determinant of growth acceleration episode. So we have like these different kind of literatures that we can, that they contradict a little bit. Me and Martin Rapedi already have written a paper that says, okay, this is not a real contradiction. There is a way to reach the gap, but still there is a tension between both literature. So what I will try to answer in this presentation is, what is the role of the real exchange rate level on the takeoff of new export sectors? What are the main characteristics of those sectors that are able to take advantage of the exchange rate stimulus? Actually, I also am going to answer if that depends on the previous productive capabilities that the country has, that the economy has. It's not like the sectors appear from nowhere. It depends of the capabilities that the economy already have, and the skills that the worker has, and experience, and so on. And the final question I'm going to ask is this, or I will try to answer, is this about this hysteresis effect. So that's the export sector survive after the end of the real exchange rates undervaluation period. So that's all the questions that I'm going to try to answer. But of course, because I'm going to do some econometrics are motivated for the theory. So actually, I will argue that the link between the real exchange rate and export performance is through a supply mechanism. It's not demand. And why it's not demand? It's not demand because the prices of exports usually are invoiced in US dollars. So what this means, I mean, this is there is this nice paper of Gopinath, but it's something that a lot of development economists and Latin America scholars have said for a long time. Is like, okay, the prices of the export are in dollars, are in foreign currency. So when we have the depreciation, it's not that the price in domestic currency in dollars, is going to decrease. The price in dollars is going to be the same. So you are not getting cheaper for the depreciation. But the thing that is happening is that you are getting much more domestic currency for the same level of export. So the profits of those exports increase. No? So that means that you are not going to increase your exports because you are competing with lower prices. You are going to increase your export because there is going to be an incentive to increase the investment in tradable sectors, because now the profitability of the tradable sector is higher. No, of course, the profitability, if the mechanism through the supply is a supply mechanism, not only the current profitability matters, also matters the future profitability that you expect to have in the future. because you are only going to invest in this tradable sector if you think that it's going to be a good business in the following, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years. So what is the conclusion of this? If we want to understand the role of the real exchange rate on the behavior of the export sector or on the development of export sector, we need like a nice experiment that we have like a large devaluation that lasts for many years in a way that we can argue that the firms that are deciding if they invest is saying, okay, now invest in tradable sectors is profitable. No? So we need something like this. That is like what happened in Argentina after the convertibility crisis. We have a very large depreciation of the currency because the crisis, I mean, that was very painful. It's not like a free lunch, of course. We have like a huge crisis, but after that crisis, the real exchange rate keep high, keep depreciated, keep undervalued for so many years. So actually, what I'm going to try to explore is this period of time after the crisis. I will left out the year of the crisis, the year 2002, because it's like a very noisy year. And I will use the 6-year period from 2003 to 2008, where the real exchange rate was undervalued, and keeping that place, actually the economic authorities were saying we should take care about our competitiveness. We should not let the real exchange rate appreciate. So that there was a clear signal for the private sector saying, okay, this is the new reality. Of course, after that disappeared. After 2010, we started a trend of appreciation of our currency, a very fast appreciation of our currency. But actually, it's going to be nice to use that to understand that, okay, now that the currency undervaluation finished, what happened with those sectors that took off during the period of undervaluation? So we need that kind of experiment, but what I will also argue is that not all sectors are going to take advantage of this new macroeconomic environment. Why not? No, and it's for the same reason that I explained before. If export prices in dollars remains the same after depreciation, exports do not get cheaper to the rest of the world, but more profitable. No, that's clear. Which are the sectors that are going to increase more the profits? Are the sectors that in their production function have a higher share of non-tradable costs. No, because if all your costs are imports, when you depreciate, okay, you are getting more domestic currency for your export, but also you are paying more for your import, so it's the same. But if you have a high share of non-tradable goods or service in your production function, the path through to the not tradable part of your production function is not going to be 100%. It's going to be much less than 100%. So then you are going to see different kind of changes in the profits of different kind of sectors. So the net exposure of an exporting firm to change in the real exchange rate is given by the share of non-tradable goods representing their cost. And of course, in most of the sectors, labor is the most important non-tradable cost from the point of view of the firms. No, we know also that the labor and the wages are important for the aggregate demand, the domestic aggregate demand. But for the firms, it's like, okay, if we have a sector that is very labor intensive, those sectors after the depreciation of exchange rates are going to increase the profit, the profitability a lot. No? So this is actually something that Frankel and Jaime Ross have said in 2006. Also, actually, Frankel is one of my mentors, was one of my mentors. So it's like I'm trying to test this hypothesis. But the other thing that we have to be very careful is like, it's not that you have a depreciation of your currency and suddenly you can export or you can develop any kind of sector. Depends on your previous capability here, depends on your product structure. So I will say that we expect that the real exchange rate fosters the occurrence of export surge episodes in those sectors close to your sectors that you are already competitive. No, it's because you have linkages. Actually, here I'm going to use the data from Hidalgo and Hausman of the product space to trying to measure, okay, this economy, in my case, it's going to be Argentina, is competitive in these kind of sectors. So this kind of sector shares some kind of skills needed with these other kind of sectors because of this product space measure that measure the proximity between sectors. And I would say, okay, it's more probable that when we face this higher real exchange rate, those sectors are the first that get developed and are able to start exporting in a competitive way. So, okay. So we take advantage. I mean, I'm not going to explain a lot about export search episode. This is something that we developed with Martin in a paper in 2017. No? Those sectors, I mean, the key thing that we have to keep in mind is those sectors are sectors that we can more or less be quite sure that they did very well. They increased their market share in the world. They accelerate the exports comparing to the 6 previous years, because I'm only going to use 2003, 2008. So I'm going to compare the average of that with the previous period. I'm going to left out 2002. I'm going to compare to 1996 to 2001. So those sectors that we are going to classify that they have an export surge are going to be sectors that they have like a clear break in the trend of their export growth, that are growing much faster than the rest of the world, and that it's not a rebound from a previous crisis. So it's like, so actually we identify that 17% of the export sector using 4 digits of the standardized international classification revision 2 have fulfilled the requirements to have an export searches. And actually it's the highest peak of the whole series that we had, that is from 1980s to 2015. And actually the previous peak was 44% lower, and that happened when we joined to the Mercosur. That, okay, yes, we're joined to a zone where you can trade more or less with some benefits of some sector also search. So these are the requirements. I will try to avoid to explain all of this, but it's like, okay, those sectors should have a very high export growth. We are comparing to the long-term growth in the world of that sector. The growth rate accelerates comparing to the 6-year period before. They have a cumulative export volumes comparing to the previous period. The export surge is not a rebound, so actually the maximum where you finish the period is 60% higher than the maximum where the previous period finished. And the export growth is not driven by world demand because you are gaining market share. So it's something that we can say, okay, these sectors did very well. So what I will try to test here, I will try to test which are the determinants of the occurrence of these episodes during this period of currency undervaluation. So I will try to test if the sector with more labor intensive have a higher probability to have a surge during the period of currency undervaluation. And also I will try to test if the sectors that are close to the competitive sectors of the economy also have a higher probability to have a surge. So this is like the first baseline result. So actually, when in the left hand of the equation is a dichotomous variable, with 1 when the sector have an export surge, and with 0 when it doesn't. So we can see that the labor intensity variable have a positive association with the probability of those sectors to having an export surge during the period of currency undervaluation. And also this agnostic relates the next variable that I try with different kind of threshold, because you can use some measure of reveal comparative advantages. I try higher than 1, that is the standard, and here higher than the 70% of the comparative advantages, that reveal comparative advantages that the economy has. So is always so robust. This is like a normal regression, like a linear probability model. But if I try a probability model, it's also the same. I mean, the results are very, very robust. So imagine that I do like several different kind of robustness tests. I don't know what happened, but my computer said something. I have done like several different kind of robustness tests. I'm only going to show this one that is okay. In the regression that I showed you before, the real exchange rate does not appear directly because I only showing the determinants during the period of currency devaluation, but the real exchange rate do not appear there because, of course, do not have sectoral variability. So if I don't have time, I can't include the real exchange rate. So what I can do is to calculate this export search episode for different kind of periods, no? Pull everything together, and then incorporate the real exchange rate. And the variable that is going to be important for me is going to be the interaction of the real exchange rate with the labor intensity index. To try to say, okay, if the real exchange rate increase, do these sectors that are more labor intensive increase also the probability to have an export surges? So actually, the answer is going to be yes. I tried two different kind of specifications, one having the real exchange rate, one having the real effective real exchange rates. So when I put, I mean, much of the difference is if I include a time fixed effects. If I include time fixed effects, the variable of the real exchange rate alone disappear and only keep the interaction of the effects, of course. But if I don't include period fixed effects, the real exchange rate is positive in most of the specifications and significant, and always the interaction between the real exchange rate and the labor intensity are positive and significant in all the specifications. So this is like quite robust. I tried everything that I could, and I imagined and I thought, and actually this is a paper that is already published in Structural Change and Economic Dynamics, but I'm pretty sure that is quite robust. So the final thing that I want to show is this hysteresis effect. So what I'm showing here? I'm showing here how the export volumes of the sectors with export surges perform during different years comparing to the sectors that do not have export surges in the economy. So of course, this increase that appear after 2002 is obvious because it's, I mean, it's a requirement I'm requiring to identify an export surges. But the thing is, like after 2008, after 2010, that the real exchange rate started to appreciate very fast in the economy of Argentina, those sectors keep the gap with the sector that didn't have an export surges before. So this is, for me, it's like, okay, you have an export, you have a currency devaluation, depreciation, very large during a period of time, but the effects that this depreciation have last despite that the real exchange rate start appreciating quite fast after that. So it seems that you manage to develop some kind of sectors that they increase their productive capacity, they invest, they pay some costs or some kind of things, or they learn, or they manage to get to a new market. And after that, after the real exchange rate stimulus finish, they still continue having this higher level of export. This is quite important because the people that support the idea that the exchange rate is an important policy variable for export-led strategy, they usually receive the criticize that, okay, but you don't want to have it's almost impossible to have always the real exchange rate undervalued. And okay, that's great. I mean, but you don't need to have always a real exchange undervaluation. Just in enough period of time helps you to develop some of those sectors. So this is mostly what I had to say. I mean, this is the conclusion. So during the period of competitive and stable real exchange rate is the one with the highest peak of export surges in Argentina. Labor-intensive sectors show a high probability of an export surge episode during this period of a stable and competitive real exchange rate, which shows that the sectors related to already competitive ones increase the likelihood of an export surge episode during this period. We find evidence of persistence in the export level compared to the rest of the export sector, favoring the hypothesis of hysteresis of paying some costs. And with this finding, only transitory period of some length of real exchange undervaluation will be needed to achieve permanent effects on export. So this is my first presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Gabriel, for this really relevant and interesting paper. I don't see if there is some question from the people that can be following the presentations online, but in case there is no one, but I do like to make some comments about your presentation. I think it's very relevant, the distinction that you made between the profitability and competitiveness. So, because in many cases we are usually identified, unless in most of the mainstream analysis, that the movement of any movement, any change in the exchange rate implies a change in competitiveness. In some cases, as you are demonstrating, is not this the point, especially where in the case that export prices are fixed in the worldwide market in an external currency. That is obvious that in this case it's not affecting necessarily, unless in the short term, the price of the export of any product, of any raw materials. What they are changing is the profitability, and in this sense it's important because profitability, as you say, can have a deep, impermanent, and sustained impact. And I think it's also important the distinction of that you have made between those economies who have, or say in other words, that to benefit for the change in the exchange rate, you must have, before the changes, you must have some competitive impact sectors. Probably the most competitive sector will not benefit from the exchange rate. But why? Because in most cases, procedurally, the strategy of competitiveness will not base it in low prices. It will have a non-price competitiveness, so there is no changes. But it's important that those sectors that are, say, at the edge of the border, precisely are those sectors in which the change in the variation in the exchange rate may benefit more, because perhaps in this quasi-say competitive sectors, they can benefit from a change in the exchange rates and depreciation in the real exchange rate. So I think it's very relevant, that distinction, that therefore something that's related to the previous papers. To benefit from this kind of reform depends on the industrial structure of this country. You must have, in order to be competitive, you must have some sectors that must be already, if not competitive, quasi-competitive. So this is the reason why, in many cases, you can see that the depreciation of the exchange rate has no impact at all on the economic activity, because they have no competitiveness sector. And it's very interesting. It has been very interesting that your last conclusion about that the export surge that takes place after the real exchange rate depreciation is not a temporary phenomenon. That is, has long-lasting and permanent effects. So, in the sense that if there is if not a rise, at least a maintenance in the level of exports, once that this depreciation even may have disappear. So these sectors will continue to be competitive, even the exchange rates move to, say, for example, the previous levels. And in this sense, this is a question that has come to my mind in the sense that, well, my question is that, well, you have focused on the situations where there has been an export surge as a result of exchange rate depreciation. Do you think, or have you studied, or are you planning to study precisely the opposite situation? I mean, do you think that there is a symmetric process or a symmetric impact when there is an export decline as a result of a real exchange rate appreciation? Specifically, can it also have, like you say, for instance, a negative impact, a negative permanent impact? Because it is important. In many cases, we are accustomed to say, well, it doesn't matter if the currency appreciates, because, well, it can have a negative impact, but it is temporary. So it will disappear in the long term when this appreciation of the currency disappears. It will end when it will, after some period, say short, some years, for instance, the exchange will again depreciate. No, the problem is that the impact is symmetric. The problem that we have is that, take care, if you generate an appreciation of the exchange rate, it could dramatically affect to the economic activity in these sectors. But due to the hysteresis impact, this effect will be permanent even after the currency, even the real exchange, starts the process of depreciation. I don't know if you have studied this situation or these experiences.
No, it's very. I mean, thank you very much for your comments. I agree in every word that you have said. And actually, I mean, I think that could be a very interesting paper to write. There are some people that already have said something about that, because it's like a phenomenon of the Dutch disease in some way. Yeah, we're not taking care about why the appreciation. I mean, we're not thinking about why the appreciation is happening, but if you have like a huge appreciation, you should have the same phenomenon of the Dutch disease. And if so, I think that actually that could be a very interesting question to try to explore. The only thing I can say that my guess is, like, of course, we are going to find that phenomenon in that case, and actually, in some sense, it's related to the previous capabilities that the economy has, because if you lose I mean, if you have some sector that you lose capability, because the appreciation of the exchange rate is so hard, it's so huge, then you are going to have less capabilities in your economy, and then when you have to rebound, you don't have those capabilities, you don't have that knowledge, so probably you will have less possibilities in some sector because it's less connected with the sector you still have capabilities. So yes, I didn't explore, but I think that it could be a very interesting paper to write.
So what? I think that I have no other comments. If you want to say anything else, I think that we can move to your second presentation, to the paper titled "Real Exchange Rate and Import Substitution Episodes: Evidence from Argentina 2003-2008."
Yeah, actually it changed a little bit the title, because after, I mean, I submitted the paper to Word Development, I got good comments and quite favorable comments, so now it's in the phase of revise, and I already resubmitted to Word Development, and I decided to change the title to make it more general and less specific to Argentina. So now it's Real Exchange Rate and Import Substitution Episodes: Evidence from a Developing Country. So for a developing economy. So this second paper is in some way the mirror of the previous one. No, but I'm going to focus to something different, that is import substitution episode. Import substitution episode sometimes in some economic sphere, is a bad word, but I will try to show that in this case, at least, could be something positive. Could be something that, I mean, actually in the last point that you are saying there, the point 5, I will try to show that there is no trade-off between export services and import substitution episodes, because the variable that are leading these episodes are the exchange rate and do not produce any kind of distortion between importable and exportable goods. So what is the motivation? Again, there is two motivations. One is academic for the writing for the paper, and another one is my own experience of life. No, so the part of the motivation is something that already Jesus told us. It's about this phenomenon that is starting to get some attention in the debate, that is import competition and in impacts on employment and other social indicators. No, this have like a momentum with the China shock paper of Asemoglu, author and another kind of great scholar of the mainstream, that they identify that, okay, the import penetration of China to the US have very severe impact on the local economies that compete with those imports. No, that's something that the mainstream literature started to pay attention in the last 10 years, maybe 10, 15 years. Something that the heterodox world already had said several times, and much before than them, but there is a debate, a live debate on that now in the mainstream too. But less attention has been paid to the relationship between import penetration and its link to the level of the real exchange rate beyond short-term adjustments. No, so it's more or less something related what we were talking some minutes ago. I'm not going to focus on export sector and tradable sector that compete with imports. So, and I think that this could be quite important, because the real exchange rate could be considered a horizontal policy that impacts the firm cost level in dollars and therefore defines the productivity threshold necessary for the domestic firm to compete with imported goods. In other words, if we have a very large appreciation of our currency, your cost in dollars, mainly labor, because there are the costs in non-tradable services or goods, are going to be so high that it's going to be so difficult to compete with other economies. Of course, you don't want to always compete because you have lower salaries in dollars. But you have these sectors that are in the threshold that we were talking about, that maybe you have a lot of competitiveness, not because you are cheaper, but because you are good, they are good quality. But if it's still the wages in dollars are too high, you are going to be out of the market. So you always have this tension. So what I will study which sector managed to substitute imports by taking advantage of the same natural experiment that we talked before about Argentina and this large devaluation. So I will also evaluate the same three hypotheses. Two are more or less the same that I already evaluated for export searches, because the mechanism is the same. Labor-intensive sectors should have a greater impulse to substitute imports in period of real exchange rate undervaluation. Because a higher real exchange rate is a change in the relative price between tradables and non-tradable. So the sector that use a lot of non-tradable inputs are going to increase the profits, because the import parity price are going to be higher now that the exchange rate is more depreciated. So they can get more profits for selling the import competing goods to a higher price in domestic currency. Also, those sectors that manage to substitute import are not appearing from nowhere too. You also need some kind of capabilities inside your economy to be able to develop a new industry or to compete successfully with imports that are coming from abroad. So also we expect that the sector that manage to substitute imports are sectors that are close to the sector where you already have capabilities, that are the sector that you already be competitive. So this is the same. I'm going to use also the Hidalgo and Hausman product space measure to try to measure the proximity between sectors. And the last one is not going to be hysteresis. It's going to try to understand if there is some kind of trade-off between developing these import competing sectors and the export sources that we just seen in my previous presentation. So because usually we have this idea that, okay, import substitution is a very bad idea for your export sectors. No, but I will try to argue that that's not the case always. If you put tariff, could be that the case because you are only increasing the price of import. But if you are having a real exchange rate depreciation, you don't have like a distortion between exportables and importables. You only have a change in the relative prices between tradables and not tradables. So we're not going to have we're not going to harm the export competitiveness, the export sectors. I mean, this is my real motivation about this. This is what happened in Argentina during the convertibility plan, or during the convertibility decade, and after the convertibility. So in the left panel of this figure, we can see the GDP per capita and the import volume. So we see that, okay, when we manage to stabilize our economy with the convertibility plan in the 90s, we have a huge increase in the GDP. We have a growth acceleration episode actually there that also is related with a huge increase in the imports. After the convertibility plan, after the currency crisis, we also have like a very high, actually higher growth rate in our GDP per capita. And also the imports increased, but in less, in more slowly growth rate, slower growth rate. What is for me very striking is if we go to the right panel, that we see the real exchange rate and the unemployment rate. So with the convertibility plan that we have a very appreciated exchange rate, the unemployment rate increased by a lot. The opposite happened after the convertibility plan. After the convertibility plan, of course, we started with a very high unemployment rate, but slowly started to decrease. No? So what for me, this is, if in the United States they say the China shock, this is the convertibility shock. No, the convertibility that was a trade liberalization as well, but actually the trade liberalization was a little bit before. Was a trade liberalization, but also was an appreciation of the currency that put a lot of pressure to import competing sectors. No, and I argue the sector that will suffer a higher impact are the sectors that are labor intensive, because the non-tradable cost of that sector labor is becoming very expensive, and they can't compete. So the opposite happened during the period of currency undervaluation. So that's the real, the real motivation that I have when I written this paper. So our strategy is to identify the occurrence of import substitution episode through the import performance. It's an indirect way to try to identify the import substitution episode. Because we know that the import performance is very related to the GDP, we have to discount the effect of the GDP when we put requirements to identify these kind of changes in the behavior or in the performance. So the first thing that I'm going to say is like, I'm going to clean the growth rate of imports by sectors, 4 digits of the standard international classification revision 2. So I'm going to run a regression for each sector to estimate this beta j, and then use that. I mean, I'm going to discount the beta j multiplied by the change in the GDP to the import growth. So that I'm going to say is an import growth net of the aggregate income. So I'm going to use that variable that I'm going to call m hat to try to put some requirements again, as well as I have done in the export search paper, to say, okay, it's very clear that we have like different kind of behavior after the depreciation or before the depreciation. So actually, this is what is going to be my main variable to the detection of the import episode. It's like in blue is the import change, the growth rate of the imports in aggregate terms. I'm also showing the aggregate terms. And then I'm showing like different kind of a specification where I discount the income effect. So we can see that, for example, during the 90s, the growth rate of the imports after the discount of the income effect is lower than what actually happened in the import growth, because of course the GDP increased and it has a positive effect on the import performance. But the situation is very different when we look at the 2000s. We can see how the import growth is much more slower when we discount the income effect, and actually in some moment it's negative if we discount the income effect. So actually this is what I'm going to try to catch to detect the import substitution episode. So after defining my variable that is going to be called m hat, no, I'm going to put more or less the same kind of requirements that I put in the export search paper, that is going to say, okay, the import volume growth should be slow. What means slow? It should be slower than the growth rate in the world of that product, because I don't want to catch products that are losing momentum in the world market. It's like I want to avoid that kind of external factor that is influencing the behavior of the product. The import growth after discounting the income effect should decelerate by how much? At least 1/3. It's a lot. I mean, always the requirements are quite stringent. It should have a negative cumulative worth, and also it should not be a normalization. It should not be because in the previous period, in the previous 6-year period, we have a very high year of import growth for some reason. It's an outlier year, and then it's a normalization. No, I will try to be like, okay, the maximum. I mean, at the end of the period that I'm analyzing, that is 2003, 2008, the level of those imports net to the income effect should be lower than the minimum level of input that they have. So 30% of the sectors fulfill these requirements during 2003 to 2008. Is like, that's in terms of sector, but in terms of volume is also more or less 30%. And one thing that is interesting that I show in the paper is that those sectors have a better performance in terms of employment also. So it's another way to say, okay, those sectors that are important less actually are increasing their employment rates. So it's like, okay, something is happening there. It's increasing the output production. I cannot use the output directly because it's less disaggregated than the import, and I want to have some kind of variability between sectors to try to understand the heterogeneity of the import. So here I run the same regression as in the case of the export searches, but with the import substitution episodes variable. This is the autonomous variable is indicating if you have an import substitution episodes in that sector or not. And here are the results, which is mostly the same as in the case of export searches. The most labor-intensive sectors are the ones that have higher probability of having an import substitution episode, and also are the sectors that are already related to competitive sectors, that you have some kind of capabilities in the economy that allow you to develop these import competitive sectors. So it's the same. I mean, it's the same here. The last two columns show the probability, but it's just because I have the tables in that way in the paper, but rows are rows as well. I try different robustness tests. Of course, I control for changes in tariff. I control for the wages of the workers, the skills in the economy, formality, status, film size, everything that they can. Import tariff, non-tariff measures, I also try to control. It's always robust. And also I do this pulling non-overlapping 6-year period to allow me to put the real exchange rate directly in the regression and to see how the interaction between this variable, this cross-sectional variable that I'm interested in, lasts if I try this in this panel setting. So it's the same. When I try the interaction between the real exchange rate and labor intensity, or the real exchange rate and diagnostic relatedness, we always have this positive sign is significant. If I don't incorporate time fixed effects, the real exchange rate alone keeps positive. If I incorporate, it loses significant. I don't lose that variable because I'm using in this specification the real effective exchange rate that has a little bit of variability between sectors. That's the reason why it doesn't get missing, but it lost significant. But because we are controlling for fixed time effects, that is taking most of the variability, but the interaction is always significant and positive. So the last thing I'm going to show here is this question: export source and import substitution episode is the conflicting relationship. That is something that is, at least in the mainstream minds, is always in that way. And because actually there is a consensus of some relevant literature that say that exporting firms are intensive in using imported. No? So someone can say, okay, the exchange rate depreciation could imply a loss of competitiveness for those who intensively use these inputs. No? But as long as those export sectors have some part of the cost in non-tradables, that's not going to be the truth, because some part of the costs are not going to increase in the same way that is increasing the price of export. So the thing is, like, the real exchange and the relation does not impose any distortion between importable and exportable goods, only between tradables and non-tradable goods. And actually, I already showed that the higher real exchange rate can be thought, sorry, this is theoretical. This is, of course, a higher real exchange rate can be thought as an export subsidy and import tariff applied simultaneously and in a similar proportion. So there should not be any contradiction. So actually what I have done, because I have this measure of product space that Hidalgo and Hausmann provide me, I can try to measure if there is a relationship or if the sectors that have import substitution episodes are close or not to the sectors that I found export sources episode. Because I have the distance between the sectors, and instead of using the Rebel comparative advantages, I can use the other dichotomous variable that I have, that is like, okay, export sources. So when I here, the dependent variable is the probability to have an export source episode, and I found that those sectors are actually related, is the second line, to the sector where I found import substitution episodes, are close in productive terms. What this means, I mean, here's, I'm not going to claim any kind of causality, because it's just a correlation and I don't know why. But what I'm sure is like, okay, at least there is no contradiction. I'm not finding any kind of negative sign. I'm just finding that, okay, those sectors are more or less related in some way. So probably there are no contradictions. And they are not the same sector, because I checked that if, okay, maybe I'm finding like a decrease in the imports in the same sector that I'm finding an increase of export, are not the same sectors, are different, but they are close in productive terms if we use the product space that Hidalgo and Hudson provides. So conclusions. the sectors identified with episodes, with import substitution episodes during the 6 years of stable and competitive real exchange rate account for almost 30% of the dollar amount of imports. It's quite a lot. The sector that responds more to the real exchange rate stimulus for substitution imports are those that are labor intensive, as well as in the case of the export sources. Well, the opposite one, this is, I didn't talk, so I'm not going to go to that because it's going to open another kind of robustness that I have done. But also we find that the sector that are close in competitive, are close in productive terms with the competitive ones are the ones that have higher probability of having an import substitution episode, and there is no contradictions or it seems that there is a positive correlation between those sectors that have import sources. Export sources are close to the sector that we found import substitution episode. So that's all.
So thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Gabriel, for another very interesting paper that is directly related to the paper that you have presented before. Well, in this sense, I would like to make you a comment and a suggestion. Is that, well, I think that in my opinion, when you are trying to analyze the impact of the episodes of import substitutions as a consequence of the undervaluation of the real exchange rate, in my opinion, you are implicitly assuming that this variation of the real exchange has no impact on, well, first on prices and then on wages. So I think that you are not taking into account the possibility of, say, an exchange rate pass-through to prices or wages. Because the problem is that perhaps you could try to control for the evolution of the wages, because you can consider the possibility that, well, if as a consequence of the increase in the price of import, there is an increase in the inflation of the economy, this such an inflation can also pass to wages. If workers try to maintain, not to increase the real wages, it's merely to maintain the real wages through a change to a increase in nominal wages. So in this sense, if you are in the current, if in the short term an undervaluation of the exchange rate may lead to higher competitiveness, because wages are maintained in real terms, are maintained in nominal terms constant, but suffer a kind of decline in real wages. If in the medium and long term wages increase as a consequence of a potential rise in inflation, such gain of competitiveness may disappear. So perhaps I think it could be interesting trying to control which is the evolution of labor costs and the wages in these sectors, because the difference may be perhaps that in some cases, well, there is no change in the wages. So in this case, we have, say, a kind of weight evaluation. This could benefit to the process of import substitutions, because the domestic production will be much cheaper than the external supply of this kind of products. But if as a consequence of this inflation, the wages rises, perhaps this may disappear in the long term. So perhaps it could be a good idea trying to analyze and to check what has happened to wages in these sectors, because perhaps we can see that there is a general or on an average increase at the economy, but perhaps in some depending of, for instance, the openness or the greater competitiveness, the evolution of the wages cannot be the same in all those sectors. So perhaps what you can detect is that in these sectors where there has taken place the process of import substitution, there has been perhaps a loss or decline in real wages, or at least a maintenance that there has not been led to a compensation due to higher growth of wages. So this would be a suggestion. Try to know what has happened and to control what has happened in wages.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, I have done that.
Okay, right.
I mean, that different ways to answer the comment on the question.
Mm-hmm.
First, I have done, I mean, when I check if the employment rate, what happened with employment rate in those sectors, I control for wages. And wages do not be, it's not significant variable to explain the different employment performance of the sector with export sources and the sector with import substitution episodes than the sector that do not have any substitution episodes. So in that sense, I did it directly. The other thing to say is like there are some paper that estimated this in a good way, that they show that the path through to import prices in Argentina in the devaluation of 2002 was almost 100% to the domestic currency, but the path through to non-tradable and to wages are like 30% or something like that. So that means that, okay, they increase a little bit, but do not recover for the huge amount. So, and actually that's why we see a different level of the real exchange rate, because if the wages increase as fast as the nominal exchange rate, the real exchange rate is going to be almost the same, or is going to lose the competitiveness very soon. So yes, actually, I mean, of course, when I try to do this control to the employment rate and so on, it's not perfect, because it's not perfect at all. Actually, when I do that, the employment, I have a more aggregated disaggregation of sectors, so I have to estimate the import substitution to a higher level and then do the analysis for that level. I think that I don't have as much data that I will wish to be able to control for everything, but I try to do the best in order to try to discover that was the case. But yes, I agree with you. I mean, it's very relevant to understand, and actually could be very interesting to understand why some sectors could be different paper. It's like why some sectors, or why the wages in some sectors are able to resist more the depreciation losses that they have than the others. So that would be interesting.
Okay, thank you. Really a very interesting set of papers.
Thank you very much. I say the same of yours. Are you going to Bilbao?
Well, I'm in Bilbao.
You're in Bilbao. Okay, so actually you are going to be in the EAP.
Well, I can say that I am the AAP man in Bilbao. So
okay, I'm going.
I am now in the process of organizing in terms of being the responsible of the.
Okay, I'm going. I'm going to present the first paper actually in the Bresser homage.
But will you come in person to Bilbao? Will you make?
No, I'm going. I'm going.
So it will be a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, the same. The same for me.
Well, I think that's perhaps the time. So I don't know if perhaps there is a technical constraint. So, well, we can finish the session. Hope to keep in contact. Bueno, esperamos seguir en contacto, Gabriel. Un abrazo.
Dale. Perfecto. Un abrazo y nos vemos en vivo.
Vale, perfecto. Muchísimas gracias, Isadora.
Chao, Isadora.
Okay. Thank you very much for your support and help. Okay. Bye.
Bye. See you.